Good evening. My name is Sonia Gurnis. I'm a Professor Emerita of the University of Notre Dame and of the Creative Writing Program. I'm delighted to welcome you this evening to our third MFA Alumni Reading Series. For the third time, we've been able to bring back some of our wonderful alumni, both to read their work and to talk to us at a panel, about life after the MFA. We would love to have brought them back in person so we could have dinner first and party after, but a little thing called COVID has come along and upset all of our lives. So we're delighted to bring them back digitally. And that allows us not only to reach out to other places, but to invite people who otherwise wouldn't be able to travel to Notre Dame and join with us in seeing them. We're going to have two readers, a poet and a fiction writer tonight. Then tomorrow at 2:20, we're going to sit down and find out the real truth about what life is is like after the MFA. And then next week, Wednesday in the evening, we will again hear a poet and a fiction writer. Along about 1998, I went with a friend who was a biologist and a poet to a poetry reading in the Rathskeller, which was about 3 sub-basements down in a place called the 100 Center that I don't think even exists anymore in Mishawaka. I went because one of my students was on the program that night reading, and her name was Angela Williams. We sat there in this rather strange setting. Angela gave her reading, and my friend turned to me and said, "She has the most extraordinary poetry voice I've ever heard, just in terms of her voice. She said, she's going to win a big prize like the Pulitzer someday." And we're going to give her a little bit more time to actually get there. She's not quite nabbed it yet, but she's continued to work. And to my delight, continued to work on issues that we saw flickers of when she was my student. And that would be history, particularly family history, and the lives and stories of Black women. Angela is now working on a project where she wants to bring to the page the stories of women whose stories have either been suppressed or devalued or forgotten. She's particularly interested in Black free women, who again are a category, if I can use that word, of people who have not been recognized very much. She researches a lot, and I'm glad to hear that also, sometimes in records that are fairly commonplace, like property records and births and other things that you can go to the courthouse and find out. Tonight, I believe, we are going to hear about a woman called Antoinette. I think that's right. And I'm delighted to meet her. Angela Williams Bickham, and she goes by both names these days, was a Cave Canem Poetry Fellow. She's a wife and the mother of 3 children, and I think a couple of them are going to be part of our audience tonight. And she sent me her CV, but the list of publications and professional conferences is way too long for me to read to you. So I'll just tell you that she's been published in places like Black Scholar, Obsidian, the Xavier Review, the Notre Dame Review, and I'm delighted to be a listener again to Angela Williams Bickham.
Thank you so much, Sonia. So thank you. And I see that I'm watching myself, so this is interesting. I haven't done a reading in a while. I haven't done a reading in a while because my writing life, I feel, has turned into my internal life. When I need to get something on the page in order to tell a story, that's when the writing appears again. And I always invite it back. My focus when I do write is on free women of color who lived before the Civil War, the American Civil War, and they lived in the South where they were supposed to be, or society said that they were supposed to be enslaved. But there were a significant amount of people who were free and who were of color, and they were had many names: free people of color, free women of color, free Negroes, free this, free that, but they were free. I'm a researcher at heart, and when someone from the past needs to tell their story, I invite them to do that. Like Sonia said, Antoinette Valentine has invited me to tell her story. I've only found her in city directories, in census records, but in my grappling with what is America, she has allowed me, this is how I speak about her and all the other women and people that I write about. She has allowed me to take creative license and really fuse together historical fiction into poetry. So my current project is to do all of that and do something like, it was going to be my ode to Americana, but you'll see it's not even traditionally like that at all. I'm going to give you a little bit of background because I'm going to try to do this without giving background. There are going to be some big historical names in it, and there are going to be some real names in this that only the people around them during their time knew who they were, but they were in the city directories of Charleston, South Carolina. There are going to be places like Charleston, South Carolina. That's my heart. I don't know why, but that's my heart. Charleston, South Carolina, and Boston. There's a lot of double consciousness. There's two sides of one coin. There's America. That's my big thing. There's America. So I'm going to start out with some definitions just to calm my nerves. But first, some definitions. Americans. We are all recycled, broken, or waste glass used in glass making and mosaics. Colored. So there are words that I don't know how to say, and that's okay for me. This word, C-U-L-L-E-T, is probably colored. In my mind, it's Calais, but there are words, and in parts of this project, there are words in other languages, like in Native American languages, that I translate, but I don't know if I'll say that tonight. But back to the definitions. Colored. Recycled, broken, or waste glass used in glass making and mosaics. Mosaic. A pattern or image made of small irregular pieces of colored stone, glass, or ceramic held in place by plaster, mortar, covering a surface. Poetry. Heightened sense of language where the line is the basic unit of the form. Each beginning, each ending is of great matter, is deliberate. Prose. Written or spoken language in its ordinary form without material structure. Life. Each beginning, each ending in its ordinary form is of great matter, is deliberate. The beginning, 1747, 1. Antoinette Valentine did not know how to exist in someone else's thought. She did not know it was possible. She was the second one of fraternal twins, born to a slave and enslaved mother and father. Her sister was sold. She was kept. But she was not first thought. Her mother owned her, but did not. Her father owned her, but could not. Samuel Valentine owned her mother, her father, her brothers, and sold her sister, but put no record of her anywhere. Records, paper, ink. No one owned her, no one did. No records, no paper, no ink. Hold the baby, I'll hold the baby. Whose baby? My baby? My baby, my baby. I'll hold the baby. Bring the baby to me. Show everyone the baby. I'll hold the baby. What about her sister? You sold her sister. Let me hold that baby. 1748, 1749, no records, no paper, no ink. Her name is Anne. Her name is Antoinette. She's a Valentine baby. She's my baby. She's mine. Keep that whisper to yourself. Let that baby walk on her own. Charlestown of the Carolinas. 2. He had one brother. They were born of different mothers on the same day. On the second day of a 3-day riot, one in a harbor alley, one in a city mansion. He was scarred by the midwife. His brother was not. We're going to be traveling back and forth between Boston and Charleston. 1770, he and Crispus knew each other, stevedores together. Was he jealous of Crispus's determination? No, he had his own. Was he jealous of Crispus's dexterity? No, his was of a different skill set, and he knew it. It was Crispus's will that intrigued him. Crispus kept a copy of the ad calling for his return. Someone wanted their property back. It took a while for him to realize Crispus had not been stolen. Not stolen a bearskin jacket, buckskin breeches, or checkered shirt. He needed to realize that Crispus was not even himself the stolen property of one William Brown. Crispus was not one thing in nearly 4,500, or even one thing in 3,750,000, or even one thing. Crispus had run. Crispus had taken up a trade. Crispus had conquered the sea. Crispus had lived to a middle age. Crispus had a will and multiple names. Sometimes the ever-blending Michael Johnson, sometimes the magnificent Crispus Attucks. Whaling shipmate by sea, rope maker by land, brother of Phoebe, son of Prince, son of Nancy, of Africa, of Wampanoag. Of an old cellar, Crispus made his Boston home. He and Crispus would sit at dawn making rope, making America a new place with each twist of thread. He appreciated Crispus's will to plan, then execute. Soon, Crispus would accept that job on the ship bound for the Bahamas, and that job on the ship bound for the northernmost Carolina, a plan for 1770. But an execution would be Crispus's reward, 5 March. 1770 would see his new form and his new function turn into his new plan and his new will, because they massacred his friend first. And this is their first meeting. June 1st, 1790, King Street. Antoinette Valentine watched him walk past her on the opposite side of the King Street walkway. She felt the sun hanging above her head and knew she was too late to gather the morning vegetables. The market in the later afternoon would be better. Just past the sunshine, she caught his face. Pale, but rather sun-bleached. Too pale, too bleached to be from Charleston. a slight sliver of blue cutting down his left cheek, an old scar not healed yet, maybe never to be healed, caught beneath a rare awning, 151 King Street. He stopped short to pat his waist pockets, another rarity, an oddity, in fact, to have such pockets for possible use. Lower left, lower right, right hand into the inside left pocket, deep into some abyss Antoinette could not see, but knew held something he desperately wanted, or maybe even needed. When comfortably he found what he was searching for, his eyes examining, then pulled to her side of the street, 150 King Street. Knowing well how to divert her gaze undetected, she did so, though undetected she was not. To his surprise, her head turned or nod. That head turn or that nod was one thing in this God-believing city that had made him smile here this time. In that one blinking, Antoinette Valentine turned back his way. She knew it had been long enough to have remained unnoticed, but his head was still turned her way. The blue scar a stitch higher on his cheek. Maybe it was a smile she caught this time, enough to make her nod in acknowledgement his way. Another merchant, definitely not from here. A ship captain, maybe, from Philadelphia, from the new Rhode Island, from somewhere other than here. How long had she been gazing? He nodded. She nodded again, picking up her skirts, gathering her composure to change direction in her walk, away toward the privacy of her home, summoning great effort to remind herself the vegetables would be better in the later afternoon. He would light his new find, this small cigar, in his right hand later on the ship docked at a wharf whose name he had almost already forgotten. Maybe he would return to King Street again tomorrow to conduct the business for which he had intended. 151 King Street, Charleston, South Carolina. Touching, brushing, July 1st, 1790. Antoinette had learned to brush past people walking on King Street, watch without being noticed, take their scent as they passed, know if they were a runaway slave, know if they were a slave at all, know if they felt conflicted, know if they loved the life they made comfortable for themselves. When passing him again, she made her hand reach out for the slightest brush of his calloused hand swinging past his thigh. She had refused to wear gloves today, just in case there had been something new she wanted to feel. The brush of hand, the strong whiff of brine was enough for her to know that he had been at sea too long. She wondered how he had firmed up his sea legs. Eating, feeding, July 12th, 1790. 1. Antoinette Valentine could cook one meal, pialo. He could drink one wine, Madeira. Pialo, purlu, paella, pilaf, pronounced as she pleased with each preparation. She washed and pre-soaked the rice, Carolina gold, clean and sweeter than its aromatic broth. It having been plucked by slaves, mother, father, brother, maybe sister. It removed from any direct heat, soaked, set aside on coals to steam until each grain stood out, separate and distinct. As Antoinette placed each shrimp gently into the same rice pot, she thought, maybe I will invite him too, for dinner with the other free people of color, though of color he was not. At a dinner of Pialo, maybe he would be a one not of color to understand, she concluded, but questioned. He was a sailor. She could smell the ocean in him, even after he had passed her by. A captain, maybe, free to make his own direction. She knew of the spices he had touted on her King Street. She could smell distant locations on him too. Madeira, aged in the hot holds of ships, a sweet, subtle Madeira would be their wine. Pialo and Madeira, free people all around her table. She would invite them all. Those who showed themselves free on the King Street she ruled, William Campbell, Harriet Laborde, John Livingston, Hagar McCall, and him. She would leave an empty chair for him, just in case he might dare to arrive, if she dared to invite his kind of freedom, if she dared to include his kind alongside her own. 2. The taste of pepper stayed in the back of his throat year round and round. It was a wonder he did not cough it out constantly. Being a stowaway taught him much quietness, many ways of staying still for long, so long. Pepper dust in the back of his throat and sun dabblings through planks of boat, sweat, paper, pepper, meat, sunlight, water, oranges. It was enough, a story. He spoke out loud most of the time at night before sleep and his personal lullaby, so any stowaway could hear. I know it is hot. I know even the pepper dust is spicy. I leave you meat for the pepper and fresh water to cool your thirst, oranges for your scurvy. Walk in the sun, let me see you. You are my brother. You are my brother. Maybe, 1822. Definitely Antoinette Valentine met Telemanque. She too played the East Bay Street Lottery once. In 1799, she too hoped for a bigger life. She, though, was content, he, though, was not. They stood side by side when buying their numbers. Her numbers 1883, his numbers 1884. They spoke. They laughed a low-pitched laugh between one who was free and one who actively inspired to be free. He would remember her as part of the multitude. She would simply remember him. He would find her later, he planned, after he set himself free. Maybe she was there when he picked up his $1,500. Maybe she was there gathering her skirts. Maybe he reintroduced himself to her using his new name, Denmark Vesey. Maybe he looked at her home for sale on Lower King Street near Antoinette's home before he found a new central home to his mission on Bull Street. Maybe he tried to recruit her successfully. Maybe she hid things for him, guns, food, water barrels, shirts, bandaging cloths, maps. Maybe at the end, no one would suspect this 70-plus-year-old woman living her hermit life on King Street. He was the old man. She was simply old. Maybe she would hold his secrets as tightly as she held her own. 2. The stowaway had believed he had seen things William G. Steele showed no one. The stowaway had believed he had heard sounds William G. Steele allowed no one. The secret music was his kind of sweet, sometimes quite quiet, but always quite disturbing to the seagulls. The guitar strings strained while emitting their songs, no delicacy involved necessarily, never was, just the plunky strumming fitting together to string 6 strings of the newly American song. Caring intensely for the scale length, neck width, neck thickness, neck angle, string tension, neck shape, fret height, and fret shape of his instrument. Note by note, he utilized a full 650 scale each night before drifting off to sleep. He had memorized his personal lullaby from sheet music some passing stevedore discarded around 1780, the Anachronon in Heaven. William G. Steele made it his theme, his mantra, his ode to himself, his I make myself a new self. The stowaway always thought it would sound quite soothing if he had been drunk. By 1814, other words had been put to it. Oh, say, can you see? The stowaway saw, the stowaway saw. The music now in 1822 was positively aggressive, coming from this water hermit who made himself anew on land. As I'm reading this, I'm believing that nobody knows what I'm talking about because there are so many references that are either obscure or part of obscure in African-American history or American history or the research that I have personally done. And that's why I think poetry now, my life after Notre Dame, is so personal. So I thank you all for listening to this. I have one more, and I think that's my 20 minutes, but I have one more. It's the ending where Antoinette actually died. She's in the death records of Charleston, South Carolina. She died on my birthday, but it was in 1822. I wasn't born in 1822, but July 16th. But I appreciate being able to read this. And I always envisioned so many footnotes and endnotes to this work, to this whole, I have this whole thing going on. But for right now, for some reason, I feel like this story of these two people, Antoinette Valentine has a name, this man, this other person does not have a name. Actually, he steals a name for a while, gets rich, and he gives the name back. But this is the last in this part of the cycle for these two. 1822, July and November. 1. On July 16, 1822, Antoinette Valentine breathed her last breath of Charleston, South Carolina salty air. No one had killed her, and she had already taken care of her one true enemy. Thus, she had no one she needed to haunt. No disease had overtaken her body. Thus, her body was no specimen of grave concern for any cadaver doctor to slice. Of old age she died, a long life, a magnificently free life, a whole life, never 3/5 of a life, ever. 75 years of human emotion. No slave memories were there in her brain cells to relive or flash before her eyes as her last moment of life, a life of her own making. Infinity branded on her middle left thigh. Countless King Street glimpsings of her seafaring stranger turned well-known lumberman kept her King Street boundaries surprisingly lovely. In her Charleston, in her South Carolina, where Brown Fellowship Society accepted her fully in the end. 2. On November 1st, 1822, on his boat, he breathed his last breath of Charleston, South Carolina salty air. From July to November, he had to live without her. whether he knew it or not. The glimpsings of her on King Street had been life-sustaining. The living was harder now, but deliberate. The bones ached now, but felt accomplished. Even in imbalance, each step embarked and disembarked his boat. He would return his stolen, borrowed name to its rightful owner and just be himself. And that was life. Memories of a harbor alley, sea, America, land, sea, and this holy city. And all the memory moments of his Antoinette Valentine, who caught him on King Street, kept a smile returning to his face, the blue scar healing on the inside. Thank you.
Angela, that was just transfixing. We were there with you.
Okay, thank you.
We were totally there. We were walking King Street in Charleston. And it just threw me back to all the times we heard you read and felt that transfixed. I think you've taught us all at Notre Dame so much. So thank you. Beautiful reading.
Thank you.
My name is Valerie Sayers, and it's been my great delight to organize this festival of returning alumni the last 3 years with Sonia Gurnis, my partner in crime. And I'm delighted to introduce tonight our next reader. Long before we meet our MFA students in person, we meet them in the writing samples they submit. And Ali Araghi's rich, witty, fanciful prose certainly caught our collective faculty eye, even before we read his personal statement and learned that he was an engineer living in Tehran who had translated Beckett into Farsi. That biography made him something of a legend long before he arrived on campus. But in the meantime, his journey also became part of the legend. His arrival to our program postponed by the ongoing diplomatic standoff between Iran and the US. He traveled to Kabul, Afghanistan to obtain his visa finally. And a year after we originally expected him, we welcomed him to the creative writing program, learned he was delightful, and watched him fly. While he was here at Notre Dame, it was just such a pleasure always to see Ali's fiction dance along the outer edges of realism and absurdism and fable. One of my favorite early stories was a surreal one inspired by his job in the Hesburgh Library, which could drive anyone to surrealism. He wasn't only writing back then, but also creating literary culture, already founding a lively online journal, Paragraffiti, recruiting other grad students to collaborate with him, and plotting a future course that would keep him making literary connections across national boundaries and languages right up until tonight. Ali is a deeply soulful and playful artist who mashes up generations of Persian traditions, aesthetics, political activism, and witness, and then throws them against sometimes American culture. A first novel we were lucky enough to see glimpses of when he was here at Notre Dame, The Immortals of Tehran, was published last year by Melville House. It's a brave and I think an important book, at once epic and miniature, historical and contemporary, charming folktale and stark expose of political brutality. As Saeed Seyfrifiezadeh says, it is an amazing literary debut that reads like the work of a master. Ali Araghi's writing and translations have been published by The New Yorker, LitHub, and Asymptote, among other magazines, and he was the winner of a 2017 Prairie Schooner Virginia Faulkner Award for Excellence in Writing. As a PhD student of comparative literature at Washington University, he's working on English translations of Persian literature. It was a privilege to work with him when he was the most gracious of MFA students. I had no doubts then that he would have a brilliant literary career because he was already having one. Please welcome him tonight.
Wow, thank you very much, Valerie. This is unbelievable. Thank you everyone for tuning in tonight. It's my pleasure, my absolute pleasure to be here with you. I wish I could be with you in person, but this is certainly better than nothing. Before I start reading, I have a little preface that I want to read to you. It's my little kind of thank you note, not kind of, it's actually my thank you note that that I want to read now. And I promise you, I did not talk to Valerie or anyone else before because you're going to see some coincidences in it. So we did not talk before I wrote this. Okay, it's on my screen, so I will be scrolling a little bit. Sorry about that. In the spring of 2011, I was reading Harry Potter for the first time. The scene at the beginning of the first book where Harry gets rained with admission letters was especially fascinating to me. I had applied to MFA programs for a second time. I had gotten admitted into a creative writing program the previous year, but hadn't been able to attend because the offer was unfunded. It had been a great disappointment because I really, really wanted to go. 1 year later, I was anxiously waiting to hear back from the schools I had applied to. Only a short while after, I received an email with the subject line, "Congratulations from the University of Notre Dame." It was from Steve Tomsula. I had gotten into Notre Dame. I was very happy. When a few days later, I told Steve about the Harry Potter scene over the phone, he told me that the Notre Dame campus was indeed not totally unlike Hogwarts. That made the promise of actually traveling to the United States to try to be a writer even more magical. But that was not the end of the story. I flew to Tbilisi, Georgia to apply for a US visa. Iran and the US cut official political ties with one another about 4 decades ago. Iranians who wish to travel to the United States apply for visas in other countries since the US does not have a consulate in Iran. Tbilisi was a beautiful city. The campus of the consulate was nice and well kept with clean patches of green grass studded with crimson flowers. It was the perfect place to get my first US visa and fly toward my dreams. But I got denied. I emailed Steve Tomsula. He started to ask around to find a way to help me. I decided to apply again. It was midsummer. Dubai and Ankara didn't have interview appointments left. Someone said, would you go to Kabul consulate, to the Kabul consulate? I said, Afghanistan? I guess. On my way back from the US consulate in Kabul, 3 stray dogs chased me in the street. I ran away, afraid of the dogs, but happy that I had been accepted, pending a background check. Days passed, then weeks. The background check was taking long. I emailed Steve Tomsula. Again, he talked to people. They were ready to be flexible with my start date. The visa finally came in September, too late for the fall semester. I turned to Steve again, and we decided that I should start the spring semester, which I did. That was not the last time the faculty had to deal with a challenging situation that I was facing. When I graduated in 2014, I told myself that all in all, I had spent the best 2 years of my life there. This lengthy preface is to emphasize that my stay and studies at Notre Dame was important, life-changing, and enjoyable for me, and that this would not have been possible without the help and support of many, especially the faculty of the Creative Writing program. Before I begin my reading, I would like to thank Steve Tomsula and Valerie Sayers. Their kindness, composure, and support were essential to my Notre Dame experience. Their astuteness in teaching and reading fiction made me a better writer, a much better writer. Thanks also to Joel McSweeney and Johannes Johansson for their enthusiasm in their craft, in their teaching, in translation, and in my work. They made me feel more welcome. My gratitude also goes to William O'Rourke, who read the first draft of my novel, and everyone else who supported me one way or another, including Colleen Hoover. And finally, I need to thank Azrain van der Vliet, Alumni, and my friends who made Notre Dame memorable to me. Sorry, I need to close this. Okay. Now, I'm going to read tonight from my novel, my debut novel, The Immortals of Tehran. This is what it looked like, the hardcover, what the hardcover looks like. And today, actually, a couple of hours ago, I received my paperback copies. This is going to be on sale in 3 weeks, April 13. So yeah, this was a good kind of coincidence to get these copies today. Before I read some excerpts, I'm going to talk a little bit about the novel, tell you what this is about. At the heart of this novel, there's a family, and the family seems to be under some kind of a curse. And as a result of the curse, every other son in the family dies young, whereas the other lives as if forever. We start by reading about one of these people in the family, one of the sons in the family by the name of Ahmad, who's apparently one of these immortals. And when we see him first, he's a young boy, and we follow his life as he grows up, becomes interested in poetry, little by little writes better and better poetry, and actually becomes one of the most famous poets in the country. He writes poetry so powerful that his poems actually literally give off light. They burn paper and cardboard. They can't be written on paper. He also becomes interested in politics, runs for parliament and becomes the youngest member of the parliament. His career ends up being short, and gets back to his poetry and gets involved with the revolution. The novel spans from the World War II, actually 1941, until the Iranian revolution in 1979. We flash forward for about 20 years after that, in any kind of short span of the novel, but the bulk of the novel happens between the World War and the revolution. One of the other characters in this novel is it's a family saga. So we read about different characters. They come onto the stage and go off. So one of the other characters is Aga. He's a very, very old man. They think that he's Ahmad's great grandfather, but there's no proof actually to that. He lives in the hollow of a plane tree, and he tells the story to Ahmad about cats. And apparently, so according to him, cats used to have their own country, and now they're in Iran to wreak havoc, to kind of mess up the country. So the implication is that whatever that's happening in Iran, in the contemporary Iranian history, is actually the doing of cats more than people. One of the characters who gets kind of obsessed with this tale is Ahmad's grandfather, Khan. He's a wealthy person in the village that they live. He owns apple orchards, and he's very wealthy and influential. Something happens that the family something happens and the family needs to migrate from the village to the capital, Tehran, and we read how Khan becomes kind of obsessed with that story and tries to prove that if actually it is true that these cats are doing what Aga says they are doing. But like I said, it's like there are a lot of other characters in the novel. There's a family tree at the beginning of the book, and there are just like 30 characters on this family tree only, and there are even more than that. So we read about many more people. There are we read about Ahmad's wife and two daughters, and like one of my favorite characters in this book is Ahmad's daughter Lala, who becomes a kind of a revolutionary. And actually, one of the excerpts that I'm going to read is about her, Ahmad's wife, and Ahmad's mother, and a lot of other characters that come and go. And there is, that's, I think, the gist of it. I'm going to read two excerpts, and if I have time, a short third excerpt. The first one is from the beginning of the novel. So there's actually nothing that I need to kind of preface before I read this. All right. This is from the beginning. Ahmad was a 10-year-old boy when he was a 10-year-old boy. Never would he have thought, as he played tag with his childhood friends in the village of Tadrish, that he would one day watch his best friend's father bite off a dead cat's ear. Ahmad could not have foreseen that he would one day work in a forge, pounding white-hot iron with a heavy hammer. His childhood imagination could never have pictured the trains that sped through tunnels under the big city, in which one grasped for a hanging strap. In short, Ahmad Torkashvand could not have fathomed that the fog that shrouded the village that early summer morning would change the course of their history. On Ahmad's sister's wedding day, the morning fog descended the mountains as if some god had summoned it from the far seas. Many in the village had been in preparations since the marriage was announced by Ahmad's father 1 month before. On the day of the fog, as it would later be called by those who decided to stay, a knocking woke Ahmad from his sleep. The sound traveled, jerky and anxious, from the front door, across the yard, into the house, along the hallway, and into Ahmad's bedroom. For a few seconds, he thought he had heard the rap in his dreams. His eyes were closing again when the repeated pounding yanked him out of sleep. He sat up, remembering his sister's wedding. His mother had told him the night before that she would leave for the orchard with the women from the neighboring houses shortly after dawn to prepare for the ceremony. She had asked him to let the chickens out of the coop, scatter some feed, and not forget to get them back in before leaving for the orchard. That was his only chore for the morning. The house was quiet. "Mom," Ahmad called out toward his closed door. He sprang up from his sleeping pad on the floor to look out the window. Behind the white lace curtain, a fog had fallen so dense he could barely make out anything in the courtyard. With its chain link fence lost in white, the coop was no more than the ghost of a large cage with blurry wooden posts. Ahmad heard the nervous knocking again, and this time Salman's voice came with it. "Ahmad!" Ahmad was not unfamiliar with Salman's banging on the door, which often meant playtime in the dirt alleys or outside the village on the mountain trails, shooting pebbles at sparrows with slingshots. But his friend had never come so early in the morning when it was time to prepare fresh meat for the customers, and he had to lend a hand at the butchery. In response to Salman's shout, the rooster, Ahmad's favorite in the coop, cried out a hoarse, "Kukulik, kuku." All right, from here, what happens is that something kind of catastrophic happens to Ahmad, and he loses his ability to talk. And actually for the rest of the novel, he kind of deals with this inability. He's kind of speechless. Yeah, so I'm going to read a next excerpt, and this is way later, a couple years away from the revolution. And in this scene, we have Ahmad's daughter, Lala, and there are other characters in this scene too that I'm going to tell you about a little bit. So we have four guys. And two girls. One of the girls is Lala, Ahmad's daughter, and Shireen, Lala's friend. And these four young men, Jamshid, Comrade Bijan, Amir, and Ebi. And these, so the girls work with the boys, and they make Molotov cocktails to help with the revolution. The other thing you need to know is that Amir is apparently one of these other people in the family who's one of the immortals. And although he's young, he kind of looks old. One other thing that has happened is that around 1960-ish, we don't have a lot of dates in the book, but a winter starts that kind of doesn't end. So there's this long 13-year winter that drags on, and we are a couple years into this winter. Yeah, and Ahmad still can't talk. All right. In the protests that followed the raid of the prison, Lala was busy making Molotov cocktails with her friends, Molotov cocktails in her friend's basement. She had taken up the responsibility of filling the heaters so she could steal oil and have a reason to reek of it when she came back home. The second day after the incident, she and Shireen made 14 bottles. When Shireen brought the basket, Lala said, "I'm going with you." "Don't get your hopes up," Shireen said. "Ebi might not come today." "We'll see," Lala answered, putting the first bottle in the basket. They topped the bottles with armfuls of parsley that Lala had bought at the neighborhood fruit and herbs shop. When the sun had set, they draped chadors over their heads and to look unobtrusive, and set off. They walked for half an hour eastward along sidewalks across a number of streets, checking out past narrow street where the bottles were to be transferred to the boys. It was rather quiet, but there was no guarantee that eyes were not spying on them from the flanking houses. The boys were sitting in a parked pecan. The girls walked past them, checking the car from the corners of their eyes. Lala saw the older man, Amir, at the wheel, and the other one of the guys, perhaps Comrade Bijan, beside him blowing into his hands. A little way ahead, they walked between two parked cars and swiftly put their baskets down on the ground, then walked away. He was there, Shireen said, pinching Lala on the arm, as she often did when her passion for Amir was too much for her to bear. What do I do? Although the man had never shown anything but politeness and appropriate behavior, Shireen thought she had spotted a desire in his eyes. At Lala's suggestion, the girls rushed to the end of the street, turned into the next, and swiftly pulled their chadors off their heads, crumpling them quickly into their shoulder bags. Then they hurried back to where the boys were parked, but the car was gone. There was no visible sign of distress or frustration on Shireen's face, but as they crunched the snow back home, now a little slower, hands in jacket pockets, she pinched Lala on the arm and said, "I'm going to whatever's happening tomorrow. I'm calling the guys tonight to tell them. Are you coming?" By noon the next day, Lala and Shireen were taking shelters behind parked cars with other people, almost all men, watching the protesters from a short distance, running here and there. The gathering had blocked a small roundabout. Cars soon turned around and left the arena to people. The slogans were about the prime minister and the corruption in the government. They asked for the release of the political prisoners and for food and warmth. Soon the police arrived. The crowd dispersed but did not go away. The stores had closed as soon as the protesters started gathering. Ignoring the men who told them this was not a suitable place for girls, Shireen and Lala drew farther forward until Shireen spotted one of the 4 boys. Soon an army truck brought reinforcement. Soldiers jumped out of the tarpaulin-covered back of the vehicle with rifles in their hands. After the shots that were fired into the air proved as futile as the warnings a colonel barked into a megaphone, a high school student was shot dead. His head tilted back as he collapsed to the ground with open arms. His blood spilled out of his chest and ran into the slush on the asphalt. 3 young men sprinted to him. When they picked up the boy's body to carry him back, they saw a red tulip had grown where his chest had touched the ground. After the revolution, the roundabout was renamed Tulip Square, the day celebrated as Students' Day. The 40th day service for the boy was held at a mosque full of people clad in black, who, moved by the tragic death, took to the streets after the service. The police and army were deployed. In her heart, Lala found an affinity with the movement, with the young men who, ebullient with gracious rage, stamped their determined feet into the snow and punched their fists into the air. At their next rendezvous, this time with Comrade Bijan and Jamshid, a few weeks later, she found an opportune moment and said, I want to be in the streets with you guys." "That's what we're fighting for," Comrade Bijan said as he closed the trunk. He had said a good thing, but in a bad way. He had not gotten the point, and he had not combed his hair again. Lala watched the red taillights fade away into the snow. A few weeks later, when another protest was brewing in the city, she showed up in Shireen's basement with a pair of scissors. "What are you doing?" Shireen asked, curious and a little anxious. Lala grabbed her own braid in her fist, and by the time Shireen stifled her short shriek and got to her feet, Lala had snipped it off with a few quick strokes. She rolled the yellow hairband off and tossed the long tress into the trash can. "You idiot, are you out of your mind?" Shireen cried, her hand over her mouth. Lala's small face looked even smaller now, with one braid sprouting on one side of her head and dangling over her breast. Lala cut the second braid and rolled the band off onto her wrist. Shireen went to the trash can and took the braids out. "Look at this lovely hair," she said. "Just look at it. Now what the hell was that about? What will your father say?" "Oh, she won't say anything," Lala answered with a narrow smile, and Shireen wondered for a moment what it would be like to kiss those thin, beautiful lips. A few days later, with her short hair comfortably tucked under a wool hat, Lala's face looked like a big hazelnut. Zipping up her loose army green overcoat, Lala watched Shireen pull up the pants that were loose enough but also a bit too short for her. Shireen could not bring herself to cut her hair. If examined closely, her head would betray the fullness of the bun underneath it. With heads bowed to avoid looks and collars turned up, they walked up and down the streets until enough people gathered. As the crowd walked past them chanting slogans, Lala jumped from the sidewalk over the ditch into the street, and the next moment she was walking among them. Her heart was pounding. She could not hear what the men cried. All she knew was that she was surrounded by them, one with the current, and none of them had the faintest idea she was a girl. No one was even looking at her. She closed her hand and threw her fist up into the air. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
So great. I think you really gave everybody a sense of the scope of this novel just in those two excerpts. And it was lovely to hear you talk about it too, and to remember those cats everywhere, or periodically popping up in the novel. It's congratulations on the paperback as well. So Angela's still with us, and we are open for questions. So let me suggest that because we can't see everybody's face on one screen, you could either write your question in the chat box, or you can raise a physical hand and hope we eventually notice you, or under your reactions button, or that's where it is for most people, there's a little raise hand icon, and that will let us know too that you're waiting to ask a question. So we have a question already from Austin.
Hey, both of those were just so excellent. But I had a question for Ali. So I know a lot of like theorists or like writers about who sort of like blend like surreality or like the literary fantastic with realism, sort of talk a lot about how a lot of the more surreal elements of their work sort of reflect back on something more like human or political. And I was wondering, I guess, if you could talk about just like how you see the elements of like, for example, the glowing poetry or the red tulip growing as sort of like thematically or like reflective on the other elements of your novel. And thanks again, both of you, for reading.
Thank you. So I think for me, so part of it I can kind of categorize under the title of perhaps world making. So what I was interested in was this world that was that sounded realistic enough, but was also a little bit fantastical and crazy. And so I needed some elements of the magical or fantastical or whatever you may want to call it to kind of create that sense. Because I had that first kind of image of cats, that was kind of the nucleus of the novel when I kind of started thinking about it. So I want to have that, and in order to have that, I needed that kind of world that kind of justified such a kind of brazen claim that cats could be look behind everything that happened. So part of these elements, like a 13-year winter or the tulip or a sound that goes on and on for years and doesn't die down, are trying to create that world. I mean, I don't think I think definitely there are going to be readings of some of these elements as metaphorical. Certainly the cat, the 13-year winter, which especially ends when the Shah leaves the country. So there will be different readings of these elements, and some of them do work that way. I mean, I did intend for them to have kind of double of functionality, if you will. but yeah, so this is like none, but not all of them, not everything. So some of them were like, for me, it was a play that, so the like second functionality for someone was, it was a kind of a play. There's a scene that a musician plays, a kind of masterful musician plays something, and all the trees that it's fall, it's towards the end of the fall, and all the trees they don't have leaves and they're dry, so they kind of bloom with the music. So that was also like on top of creating that world, that was kind of my homage to that, like musician that's an actual person. So yeah, sometimes they work multiple functions. It makes sense.
Thanks. I have a great question from an upcoming reader, Sheheryar Sheikh, who's going to be reading next week. And this question is for both of you. Maybe you can, that says maybe you can ask it for me. Can I? How burdened do you both feel by history, the obligation of needing to write about it, as well as how liberated do you feel by having the material there within history for you to reach into? Maybe you could start off, Angela.
Yeah. Burden for me, I feel, was it burden that she
how
wrote
burdened
in that
do you feel by the obligation of needing to write about history?
I feel like I have no choice for some reason. I can't get away from it. It started out really at Notre Dame, where I felt like I needed to find more information about enslaved women and give them voice, since their voice was not written down necessarily in the history books. And it was something internal that I really can't explain. I've tried to walk away from it, but my research interests keep going back. I've gone from enslaved women to runaway slaves who return to the South, to free people of color who live in the South. But then I always realize I'm writing about me, I'm just writing about myself, some kind of way where I'm looking for my own voice, or have been looking for my own voice. And maybe somehow history is allowing me to figure out my current nature of who I am. And that's how I appreciate having to do all this digging. I hate that I have to do all this digging on one hand, because that means the history that I'm looking for should have been written down, but it's not, for so many different reasons. But the fact that I can dig and go against the Black versus white, Black and white, and find that gray area, I'm grateful that I can do that. And I feel like there's, when I was at Notre Dame, I had this thing for the name Sally. Right now, the thing is for this name Rachel, and I'm finding so many Rachels, free women of color, and I want and I need to tell their stories. So Rachel is part of this poetry cycle, but she's also actually going to be part of an artistic collaboration that I'm doing with an artist out of California. So it's an obligation that I personally can't get rid of, but I don't see it as a burden per se, but it is a need. So
thank you so much. Beautiful answer, Ali.
So I think for me, it started as a kind of.
I can't tell if, did everybody hear that?
Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes, okay. We heard you fine, but somehow your picture was frozen.
Oh, there was.
Oh, okay. So yeah, for me, I feel like somehow it started with some kind of an identity thing. So I moved to Notre Dame, and after a little bit, I felt like I was drawn to writing about Iran. Now that I'm thinking about it, it was some form of kind of going back to like who I am. Like it feels like I was kind of isolated from the I was kind of uprooted from that, from where I knew I was kind of most comfortable. I was in this new place, new culture, new language. Everything was new, so I felt like, so one part of it for me was to kind of go back and write about what, like, Iran and the history, right? But like I said, so what I had was that first image that I thought was interesting too. That cat stuff, I was so interested by that. So that was it was not just like, let's write about history because I'm Iranian, right? So I had that thing that I thought was interesting, had something fictional in it, but then later on it became something about the history. And in general, I feel like there is this kind of pressure on writers who are from other countries, especially third world countries, or close to where I'm from, to write some kind of fiction, some kind of literature that is either about something like national, it has some national elements to it, or about some actually playing to some kind of cliches that I would say that some mainstream media here wants to hear, right? So it feels to me like there was this force for me to write into this narrative of Iran/Middle East as this place of constant turmoil, oppression by the Middle Eastern, oppression of the Middle Eastern by the Middle Eastern. So there was a little bit of that too. And then kind of to go back to the question that Austin asked, part of that playfulness, that cat thing, the magical thing, was a little bit of me pushing back against that no, I'm kind of playing with that. I don't necessarily want to give this narrative kind of playing to that black and white narrative. So I just want to play with it. And so in terms of burden versus freedom, so I would say that magical realistic tropes actually helped me feel kind of a little bit more free, that I'm in control of my history. I can put cats in it. So, there's a little bit of that too.
Thanks. We have a question from Chloe Honorato.
Good evening, everyone. First and foremost, I'd like to say it was an honor and a pleasure to sit in on these wonderful readings. Thank you so much. And I have a question for Angela. I was enchanted by your description of being inspired by Charleston, South Carolina as being this place where, if you feel it holds your heart. And I was curious, have you ever actually visited it? And if not, do you think you would ever want to go? Or are you afraid if you would go in person and see it as it is in this modern age, that it would in some way impact how you write about it in the past?
Oh, I've been to Charleston many times. I'm originally, well, since I was 2, I was from North Carolina, which is about a 2-hour drive from Charleston. For some reason, Charleston holds an intrigue for me. I actually lived there one summer I had an internship at National Trust for Historic Preservation. And so I was allowed to go into museums and go into their archives. I worked in a historic house. I actually had an experience at one of the historic houses that I, to this day, can't describe without wanting wanting to cry, not because of what I knew about the house or what I saw, but there was a feeling that I had with just one room in the house that to this day, if I see a picture of that room, it scares the life out of me. But that's a whole nother story. But then there's this other story in my family that my grandmother's great-grandfather, who helped raise her, remembered being enslaved, and he remembered being torn from his mother in Charleston, South Carolina. We cannot corroborate that, if that's the word. We can't say that's true, but that's a family story that I always heard. I took in junior high school, I took a picture of a woman making the baskets, and she almost cussed me out completely. And there is a tension between taking other people's stories, I feel, and then telling your own story and trying to figure out what needs to be said. So going back to Charleston, I don't think I could ever live there, but I've been there. I go there when I'm in the South all the time. And I will definitely go do more historic tours, but I will never go back to the Aiken Rhett house in the slave quarters, the first room on the left. When you go up the steps in the urban slave quarters, the room is red. It makes no sense to anyone else that I tell that story to, and I usually tell it in a long, drawn out way, but it makes no sense why I had the guttural reaction to that room that I've ever had, but I'm starting to be able to write about that now. So Antoinette Valentine, actually in my cycle of poems, she puts a curse on that room in order to protect her sister who has to live in that room. But that place is very tangible to me in current day. And I have like all sorts of death records and city censuses and housing records and plats. I have it all around my place. So it's very, I just can't get rid of Charleston for some reason.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other questions? We will have plenty more chances. I'm talking slowly in case someone decides to raise a hand. We will have plenty more chances to talk to these two fabulous writers and also to our other two fabulous writers, Sheheryar Sheikh and Jessica Maich, who are all four going to be on the panel tomorrow, which starts at the odd hour of 2:20 p.m. That's because it's a class hour here at Notre Dame, and we wanted people to be able to come right on time. So we're really looking forward to that, and to a week from tonight when we'll have the final reading with Jessica and Sheheryar. And I see no hands. Speak now if you can't manage the little button. Okay, I think it's been a beautiful night. Welcome back, and thank you so much. Just delightful. Good night, everybody.
Really enjoyed it. Thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you, Ali.